This meeting of the Finance and Governance Committee begins now.
My name is KENDRA and I am chair of the Denver City Council Finance and Governance Committee. I'm going to start with some introductions. First off with Councilwoman Sawyer.
Good afternoon, Amanda Sawyer, District 5.
Councilwoman CdeBACA, District 9.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, STACIE Gilmore, District 11.
Good afternoon, JOLON Clark, Lucky District 7.
Good afternoon, Amanda Sandoval, District 1.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Deborah Ortega, City Council at Large.
Good afternoon, Paul Cashman, South Denver, District 6.
Thank you all for being here. I have a few announcements before we get started, and I will welcome Councilwoman Kinich, who is walking in. Thank you. First of all, I have been asked to remind council members to be sure to read the email from our Deputy CFO, Margaret Danuser. She was asking for our input on how to prioritize phase 2 of coronavirus relief funds. So if you have not seen that email, she sent it on Saturday, June 6th. So please get back to her in the next couple of days. We are going to have FinGov next Tuesday as scheduled. We'll have a charter proposal from Councilwoman Kinich and a presentation on the 16th Street Mall. But we are also working on possibly scheduling a special FinGov on Wednesday, June 17th at 1:30 during the BIZ meeting time. BIZ is going to be canceled, so please stay tuned for that. We'll let you know. We'll have a presentation from our Department of Finance. Today, we had to change the agenda. We are only going to have one proposal from Councilwoman Sawyer regarding council approval of mayoral appointments. Her other proposal to amend our charter language related to meetings will be heard on June 23rd. And just as a reminder, committee is our time for discussions and questions, and we do not kill bills in committee. So today we will decide if we believe that this is ready to forward to the full council, and if we don't think it is, we could choose to delay it to a date certain. So with that, I will let you two begin.
Perfect, thank you so much. If we have learned anything from the demonstrations that have happened over the murder of George Floyd and the public comment that we've heard in this chamber last night and on Thursday, it's that the people of the city of Denver are crying out for more transparency and accountability. Now more than ever, we owe it to our constituents to give them a more representative government that responds to the people. 72% of constituents surveyed said that they want this referred to the ballot. So I ask you to join me in supporting their demands for more accountable government. This proposal gives Denver residents a voice through their independently elected city council representatives. It respects our strong mayor form of government while bringing a bit more balance to the system. If approved by the voters in November 2020, it would mean that in addition to the chiefs of police and fire and the Denver sheriff, a majority of city council members would have to approve the executive directors of all of these agencies, including the city attorney and the manager of safety. I've researched how other cities with strong mayor forms of government like Denver's function and what kinds of processes and procedures the cities use to bring balance, transparency, and accountability to their communities. In my research, I found something very interesting. The majority of Denver's strong mayor sister cities, the cities that we use when we consider our similar policies, participate in a process where their city council members have some form of approval over the mayor's appointees. Denver is the only strong mayor system in the state of Colorado that does not follow this practice. And I think it's time we institute it here. So let's talk a little bit about what this process looks like. The mayor would be the sole person who chooses who the appointees are. So we're not recommending a slate that would be provided to city council or anything like that. The mayor still chooses their appointee, and then that person is brought to council. It would be a straight majority of council approval, so 7 members, a standard resolution, so 1 reading with a 30-day shot clock. Appointment would go through on consent, and if called out, questions would be in the supervising committee for that agency. So for example, if it were the head of the airport, it would go through biz committee. And then after the committee, it would go through a full vote of council. Other considerations we need to just talk about: the mayor would retain sole dismissal authority. Under our charter, the council does not have the power to engage in administrative affairs, and it would remain that way. That's just to keep everything else exactly the same. The resolution calls for positions to be filled in a timely manner. That's not specific wording because, you know, a timely manner in this day and age could mean up to a year to fill a position. That's a reasonable executive search amount of time. But we do want those positions filled as quickly as possible so that there's some leadership, those leadership roles are filled. If it's passed by a vote of the people, it becomes law immediately upon publication, but it's not retroactive. And a stakeholder process should be convened to determine the approval policies and procedures. So we did some outreach to the community. 59% of the community, so we mentioned earlier, 72% of people believe that this should be, as we said, should be referred to the people. 59% would support it, 13 said that they wanted more information on it. We also did a significant amount of stakeholder outreach, and this is just some of the stakeholder outreach that we did and background research, just so that you're aware. And then I'll turn it over to Councilman CdeBACA before we go to questions.
And just again to remind you all that most people we talked to did not know that we don't already do this. Most people thought we already do this. So going back to what Councilwoman Sawyer mentioned about us being one of the only cities in our peer cities that don't do it, I think it's, you know, important for us to recognize the public's perception of what is done. And if they have a misperception because they believe it's more transparent than it is, then we should rise to at least meet that basic perception of some semblance of balance.
Thank you. So we've provided you with frequently asked questions, which are also provided to the public and uploaded onto our Granicus system, so the public has access to those, along with the presentation, the language of the bill itself that is actually proposed, and then this information, which is just the quick overview of which other strong mayor cities do this. And this list, just so everyone is aware, is a research list that comes from Ballotpedia. That's where we got the list of strong mayor cities from. So just so everyone kind of knows where that came from. But we're open for questions. We are trying to kind of give a pretty straightforward presentation and then answer your questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I'd like to welcome Councilman Hines. So does anybody have any questions? All right, Councilwoman Ortega.
Just a quick question about what the anticipated effective date would be. So once it passes, regardless of who's in office, would you assume it takes place immediately? So if there are vacancies that come up, that it would go into effect right away and not wait for the turnover of a next mayor, for example?
Yes, it's not retroactive, so nobody would have to go through the process all over for their jobs, but it would be effective immediately, so any open positions would then have to go through the process.
Thanks.
Councilman Cashman?
Yeah, thank you. So the most frequent concern that I hear, which you address in question 4, will this deter people from applying? So the system that you're proposing is the mayor and his team go through their vetting process, pick a candidate. Once the mayor has his or her candidate, then it would come to council, okay? And I do see some merit in the concern that it then becomes a public process, okay? So I wonder, and I was really interested in the research that you did, where there has previously been an upfront vetting where council was involved in that earlier vetting process. And I wonder what your thoughts were about not choosing that method, but going with the method that you propose.
Do you want to take that, or do you want me to go for answer that? Okay. That's a great question. So the reason that we proposed this particular structure is because in the research that I did and speaking to other cities, this is the way other cities do it. We wanted to make sure that we were being respectful of the strong mayor system that exists. So what has been done in the past in the city of Denver and is done in some other cities is actually done it's by the choice of the mayor, right? So if the mayor so chooses, and it's actually been done in the city of Denver previously with previous mayors, there is a process where a mayor could, if they wanted to, put together a group of people that could involve other community stakeholders to do that process. And that's a different sort of thing than what we're proposing here, although we talk about it in our frequently asked questions, in that it was a process that didn't deter qualified candidates from applying for the jobs. But the process itself is a different process, right? So what we're proposing is respectful of the strong mayor system. It allows the mayor the space to choose whoever they want. If they wanted to put together that stakeholder process, they could do that. It's been done in Denver before, it could be done again, but that's that mayor's choice to do that. What we are trying to do is be respectful of a strong mayor system, but also ensure that there is buy-in, partnership from council, and accountability and transparency in the process, which is a separate discussion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does, I guess. But if this goes before the voters and is approved, it's part of the charter. So that's the rule that the mayor would have to follow, even if the mayor chose to include council in an earlier vetting process. It would still need to come before committee, et cetera. The other thing I wonder is, how did you actually determine that it doesn't deter candidates?
Talking to people. So, for example, I spoke to people who participated in the process in the city of Denver on some of those previous vetting groups, and spoke to a member who's actually the president of council in Baltimore, who's actually running for mayor now. So his name is Brandon Scott, and he is the council president in Baltimore and running for the mayor of Baltimore. And we spoke for a long time about, what does this do? What does it look like? Does it deter people from applying? Have there been problems? And asked a lot of those different questions of both the community members who've sat on these previous groups with previous mayors here in Denver, and then, with Council President Scott in Baltimore. And both of them said the same thing. This is a process that really works to bring back transparency and accountability in the process.
Thank you. That's all, Madam Chair.
I have some questions, but okay, Councilwoman Kniech?
Thank you. Looks like Brandon is winning the election, Brandon Scott, so he may be the mayor soon. They have their election this week.
Yeah.
I had a question about the piece in here where you say prior councils, or it has happened in the past. Did we actually have it? Because we haven't always had the same strong mayor system. It has evolved. Did council ever in your legislative history have any of these roles previously in prior generations?
I don't understand what you mean.
You mentioned that, that there's a history of doing this in the city, and I didn't know if I was misreading that, but in prior generations, 50 years ago, 70 years ago, has this council ever had this role? Did we research the history of the charter?
Not formally.
Okay, so even though the mayor has gotten some powers over the years, this wasn't one that changed back?
Correct.
Okay, sorry. And then I guess, we usually do questions and comments in a mix. Madam Chair, do you have a preference?
Some clarification there, though.
Oh, yeah.
We didn't always have the manager of safety structure.
Right.
So there are some nuances to saying that we haven't had this power before. there are some structural things that did change that reduced power in an umbrella fashion over our Department of Safety agencies.
Got it. Okay, thank you. And I guess I just will share my perspective that it may, in fact, discourage some candidates. That's quite possible. I think that that's not enough of a challenge or a concern for me not to support this. In my view, it's a pretty narrow role, and it's a role to protect against, for example, nepotism or unqualified candidates. That's probably the biggest role that it really is. So I see it, it's not a selection power. It's not a, and I think, it may test out for the ability to collaborate, right? I will say this, we do have a strong mayor form of government, but we also have a pretty permissive culture in our ability to access and work with departments. When I work with counterparts in other cities, in some strong mayor systems, you don't get to work directly with department heads the way that we have. You have to go through some weird office in the mayor and get permission, and you don't get a call back. Or, we have pretty responsive, interactive department heads, and I think that's a good piece of the culture we've built here. And so making sure that folks in those jobs kind of get that culture and the fact that we do work well together, I think in many of the days of our jobs, a lot of stuff doesn't come to this chamber because we work on problem solving it together directly with the department. So to me, that's what this is about. It's about just, a very final safeguard against nepotism or not being qualified. And then it's, hopefully paving the way for that kind of collaboration, which benefits our residents because a lot of them come to us for problem solving and therefore we go to these department heads. So it's a different piece of the city work that we do than the legislative role. And I think it's an important one. And it's one that's less written in the charter, but it benefits the people of Denver that we do it. So that's why I think it makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yeah, Councilwoman Kinch, I think you hit on something really important that we didn't get a chance to talk about yet with the questions, and you're exactly right. I mean, this does allow us to create a partnership in a way that doesn't necessarily exist right now, or exists but not formally right now. And so, what we're really looking at doing here is creating a structure that would be formalized in our charter in a way that will then be, formalized for years to come, right? If our charter is our manifesto of who we are as a people and how we want our government to move forward and who we want to be as a city of Denver, I think it's really important that you point that out, right? That this is what we are saying is that what is important to us is collaboration and partnership and cross-communication between agencies and between areas of government. And I think that that's exactly right. So thanks for pointing that out.
And just to add to that, there are people who are currently in these positions in the city right now who believe that this would foster more collaboration and do not believe it would be a deterrent, and have in fact expressed that if it was a deterrent, that would be an immediate red flag for us, that wasn't the right candidate, because that is the nature of the job, to interface both with the constituents of the city, but also city council members, specifically because they're coming to us with the hopes to get approval on different things. And so the inability or the deterrent of having to talk to us is problematic from the get-go.
Okay, thank you. Councilman Clark?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both. It's weird seeing you standing over there here. I'm still like, it's weird being down in the well too. So these are strange times. But thank you both for all your work on this. Thank you, Councilwoman Sawyer, especially for we've talked on the phone many times and answered questions. So thank you both for all of this. Some just random questions as we were going through. Pueblo's strong mayor? I did not know that about
They
Pueblo.
actually just voted to have a strong mayor system recently, so they're new.
So they're newly strong mayor. I did not realize that.
Yep.
And so it's just Springs, us, and Pueblo in the state.
That's correct.
Okay, and then it is a majority that do this per the rest of the cities taken outside of Colorado. It's like a 10-7 split by my counting in your thing. Did you talk to any who don't? To see why they don't, and was there any trending that you saw? Like, did it used to be a 5 to 15 split, now it's a 10 to 7 split, or like, is there movement in this space, or the ones that have been like that have always been like that, the ones that have been like this are always like that? Did you get that deep into any of that or talk to any of the ones who are like us on why they haven't done this, or did they and they moved back, or anything like that?
So great question. The big one that we looked at was Pueblo, because they just adopted the strong mayor system, and when they adopted the strong mayor system, they adopted council approval of mayoral appointees at the same time. So that was something that they chose to do when they adopted their strong mayor system, as a reflection of the Colorado Springs law. So up until,
And Colorado Springs is a lot newer strong mayor than Denver.
Exactly. And they are reflective of a number of other cities that are sort of beginning to move that direction. So there is really more of a...
So you don't have a chart that shows,
like
but generally you would say newer, more people who are doing it now are choosing to go that way, but maybe not a movement of people like us who've been like that moving that way?
I don't feel comfortable telling you it is a trend in this direction, but I feel comfortable telling you that the research that we did makes it seem like it's a trend in this direction.
Okay, fair enough.
And to add on that, research about cities that don't run their agencies by political appointees speak to the fact that the goal in those places is not to politicize agency work through the appointee process. And so I think when we think of politicizing agencies, we have a city where we have politicized agencies. And what we're trying to do is at least create that balance, a check and a balance for politicized agencies.
Okay. And then curious, I don't know if this is you guys or if this is legal. John. I'm just curious because you mentioned in the FAQ, and I think you mentioned it, that any removal, not that I'm proposing that you add that to this, but any removal would not be allowed because we're not allowed to engage in administrative affairs, but the hiring is also an administrative affair. So I guess what's the legal thread, or is it that if you change the charter, we also could do that and you just chose not to do that? I guess that was the part I was confused about.
Hiring is not technically hiring in this situation. This is a political appointee, so they're not career service, and so
wouldn't that be the same on the firing if it's position specific?
Right, and so we don't have power now over each other's political appointees, even when there's a dual confirmation to remove them. It's not us who are dealing with them in that way. And so the mayor would still have the power to say, this agency head is not working out. I don't think we even fire appointees. Most of the time they step down. So I think that's where those things get handled. Okay,
I guess I was just confused as to and maybe there was more to it than just, but the FAQ is, if council members will have approval authority, but not dismissal power, and it says no, council does not have the power to engage in administrative affairs, and so to do so, but this seems like we're changing on the front end of that. So is it that we can't change on the back end, or just that this doesn't change on the back end? So it actually changes, as I understand it, and Kirsten, you might want to clarify this a little bit, but it changes the nature of at-will employment to have a little bit. But Kirsten, do you want to clarify? Sorry, is my question making sense? Am I being clear?
I understand the question,
okay.
and I can answer this. This is Kirsten Crawford, Legislative Counsel. We have a charter provision that I was just going to pull up to give you the citation, but that divides the power between council and the mayor has all of the administrative powers in the city as the charter currently stands. And administration, one of the fundamental powers that the mayor has is the overseeing and retention and termination of employees. So the decision was made to not change that provision in the charter also, which is what we would need to do here to the extent council wanted to have a role in the termination process. Sorry, I want to just clarify one more thing. We do not typically in our appointment provisions create property interest in the employment. We have done that with some employment like public safety, some other employees in career service, but typically appointees do not have a property interest in their employment.
I guess I'm still struggling with why is supervision and firing of an employee fall as administrative affairs, but the confirmation of a hiring does not? What's that? What's the
It's
difference?
because the charter says so. Like, that's the way the charter's written now. It's a separate provision.
I think it's a
So,
great thing to
so
clean
the,
up, but not in this.
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead.
it sounds like Councilwoman DeBACA wants to take, do you want to answer this?
I think it's a separate issue, and I think that that's a different charter change that arguably we should be making, but it's separate from this, and it would be, to change it is bigger than this.
So it is that it lives somewhere different and it's a totally different animal, the hiring and firing somewhere in there.
That's correct. I think
Okay.
that's a
Okay,
short.
sorry. That gets to, okay, and then just to clarify, this is not all appointee, just head. So for instance, Parks has the executive director, and then there's a deputy director of Parks and a deputy director of Recreation. This is just the head. The other two would continue to operate as they do today.
That's correct. So actually, when I was talking to Baltimore, that's how they do it. They actually have an entire structure. They do hundreds, they approve hundreds of appointees. And and it's when I was originally doing research into this, you know, I was looking into how do other structures do this? That was one of the things on the table. It was like, do we do it all the way? There's absolutely no way under our structure and the way our staffing works and the way our structure works, we could ever take something like that on. It's just not. It doesn't make any sense for the way we function and the way our staffing works. So this is very narrow. It is simply these 14 positions, and that is all.
Okay, thank you for the clarity and sticking with me on me trying to understand on some of that.
And just to give you some numbers, I think Sky might be able to clarify if I'm wrong, but I think we have 57 or 58 mayoral appointees in the city, and this is only addressing 14.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And also, just to clarify, all of these positions are charter positions. So according to the Denver City Charter, these are positions that cannot ever go away in our community, right? So Denver cannot function without these 14 positions according to our city charter. They are listed in our charter, and that's why these are listed in this proposal.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Councilwoman Sandoval.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the beginning of your introduction, you said 72% supported it. How many people did you survey? Did you do a Google spreadsheet, or did Facebook, or how did you get that?
It was a Survey Monkey. We worked in partnership with Interneighborhood Cooperation and asked them to work with all of the different RNOs with, I think it's over 200 RNOs in the city at this point. So we asked them to pass it out to the RNOs and have the RNOs send it out to their communities, and then we sent it out on all of our different social medias, asked all of you guys to send it out via your social medias to all of your communities and newsletters. And so we had a little over, I believe, 300 responses.
300?
Yeah.
For the whole entire city?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yep.
And then,
To add, so if you recall, our proposal folded into this, and so when we were originally doing our stakeholder engagement, we had a couple thousand survey respondents on ours, and I can provide that data if you need it, but it's a little bit separate. It's about the sheriff, and so we had stakeholder engagement that wasn't specifically about this, but was a component of this that could fold into that data.
I was just wondering, because it doesn't say how many people of the seven, right, on a chart like that, you should have the total amount.
Oh, yeah, so it was a little over 300. I think it was 308, do you remember? I believe it was 308 total from this. But just to remind the people who are watching at home, because Councilwoman CdeBACA just brought it up. So originally, my proposal was only council approval of the mayoral cabinet appointees, which is 11 positions. Councilwoman CdeBACA had originally proposed an elected sheriff position to go to the public to vote on in November, and instead what we decided to do was to bridge our two proposals and to bring them together and to add the 3 heads of safety under this proposal. So a lot of the feedback that we did that is not included in these numbers that you're looking at here is stakeholder feedback that was included from those conversations as well. So there is a whole sort of section of the discussion that is not even being talked about or presented here today, that is community feedback and discussion regarding the community's desire to potentially have an elected sheriff in the city of Denver as well.
And to clarify the numbers on this, remember it goes to Inc. So you're getting about 2 or 3 people from each RNO that are giving their input as representatives of their RNOs, and we have a letter from Inc. supporting the initiative.
Okay, that's it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilwoman Gilmore?
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for the hard copies. I know we're not supposed to do that, but super nice. I don't have a printer anymore, so printing is a pleasure, I have to say. So this is awesome. I wanted to understand if you have, from Colorado Springs and Pueblo, samples of kind of the questions, or, what are the vetting questions or the framework that their city councils use to ask questions? Because I know, we could have somebody come to biz or to whatever committee and we just pepper them with questions, but I am thinking for transparency for the public, what are those high priorities that city council wants to know that a candidate can fulfill as an agency head? And, the easy ones are, nepotism and conflict of interest, that's simple to answer. But additional questions I would have, and I just want to understand your perspective on it, are what is that individual's understanding around equity, and how can they implement equity or expand equity in their agencies and hold folks accountable? The process that individual would undertake to engage and empower the community to be involved in decisions, that it's not just tokenism, that it's really authentic engagement. And then what is their stance on community participatory budgeting? By us going through this process, I was thinking this morning, and just kind of a lot has changed in our world since you all were here talking about this, and really to have that community input, and that we are those representatives to ask these questions of folks. But how would kind of the vetting process be codified? I'd just be interested in hearing more about that.
You speak to 2 really important things. One, that this was so forward thinking that it's more important now than it ever has been before, or when we originally presented, because of those reasons. So currently there is no process for us to engage with appointees for heads of agencies right now. And so there's no way for us to ask any of those very important questions. We think that is the biggest goal of this process, being able to create our own set of questions that would help us vet who is appropriate for this seat or for these political appointments. We don't have that created, because I think that would be putting the cart before the horse, and I think that's something that we should create jointly as a body. But what I can say is that Councilwoman Kinich and Councilwoman Black, we all sit on the boards and commissions appointment, and we're trying to figure that out ourselves. And it would be something that we could potentially start thinking about as we go forward into it. And when we get this person in front of us to approve, to confirm, we can go through a standardized list of questions every single time with every single agency head. And it can touch on all of those things that our hearts desire.
Great. Are there examples of what the other municipalities maybe use?
So that's a great question. And I just wanted to point to this, the last bullet point on this slide really quickly. So I spoke to a couple of the municipalities about, like what questions they asked. But really, I think what's important is we need to convene a stakeholder group and sit down in, ops or whatever, however we want to do it, and sit down and really have a discussion about what this should look like and how we want it to work if it is approved. So I think what needs to happen, because there are some other questions. I know, Councilman Flynn isn't here today, but he had some questions around, what happens if there's an interim appointment, right? And things like that. So there are some issues that aren't appropriate to write into the charter that need to be discussed in policies and procedures that we need to flesh out as a body. And those kinds of questions and conversations, including what kinds of questions we would want to make sure that we're asking, are conversations we need to have. But that's not something we felt comfortable proposing or talking about, because I think that's something we as a body need to sit down and have a discussion about.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
But when we are ready for that, I would be happy to bring some examples.
Thanks for clarifying. I just wondered if there were some other examples that other cities maybe have done some of this work that we could actually look at.
I mean, I could talk for hours, but I'll spare you because I want to give you time back in your day. So.
No worries. Thanks.
I know we have a few more questions. I just wanted to follow up on that. In your presentation, you made it sound as if it's going to go smoothly, but now we're talking about questioning people, and that's something I'm not sure I feel comfortable with, of sort of grilling someone in this room. And I don't know, do you have any comments about that? I thought that we were going to avoid that, but is that something you think might happen?
I mean, the purpose of this is, so remember, this is not an interview, right? This person has already been chosen by the mayor to be the appointee, right? So that's not the purpose of this. The purpose of this is to sit down and have a conversation with this person to make sure that they have, if there are lingering questions about something or, whatever the case might be, that those questions can be answered by council. And also, I think it's important to note that if this person isn't comfortable sitting down with council and having a conversation, then that's a real problem, because that's part of the job description. All of our heads of our agencies are up here, standing here all the time, having conversations with us about what's going on, educating us about the issues that are facing, whatever their particular agency is. And if they're not comfortable doing that, then frankly, that should disqualify them from the position right there, I think. So that's a problem. That's a red flag, I think.
My question was not so much about their discomfort, but that, I don't know, someone might have some personal issue with someone and grill them in this room, which I wouldn't feel comfortable with. But in any of the other cities, is it a smooth process, or did you learn about cases where they didn't approve someone?
Yeah. Yes, I can tell you about that in 1 second, but go ahead.
I think smooth is relative, right? When we get mayoral appointments where we don't have a real authority to kick it back, we still have the responsibility and the privilege to ask questions of them. And I don't think that any of the questions that Councilwoman Gilmore just recently raised are unreasonable for someone who is helping us run our city. I don't think anyone's going to be asking questions that are personal in nature. I think people are asking questions that are directly linked to what we expect their performance to be in these roles. And you might not have questions when they come to the floor for confirmation, but there might be other people on this body who do have questions that I think are entitled to have those questions answered, whether or not we have power to kick that back.
Okay, I just was trying to better understand, because it sounded like one thing and maybe it's going to be something different.
Yeah, and I think that that's, do you want?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay, no, I think that that's fair, right? I mean, that is, I think, the crux of the issue, and I think that's why we need to sit down and have a discussion about policies and procedures and how we, as a council, want to make sure that this looks and runs when we're inviting an appointee, if someone were to call it out, to come, because remember, the proposal is for it to go through on consent. So it would only be if someone were to choose to call it out for an interview, which is not even an interview, a conversation, really, in the first place in the supervising committee. So, what does that look like? How do we want to manage that? That's a policies and procedures conversation we need to have. In terms of the research I've done in all of these, hold on, let me go backwards. There we go. In all of these cities, in all of the appointees that these cover, so we're talking hundreds and hundreds, probably thousands of appointees, I found one case where an appointee was not appointed. One. So, and I'm happy to talk about that, but that says a lot, I think, about the success of this and the purpose of this and the value of this.
And in an ideal situation, if we have this collaborative relationship with the mayor to appoint and confirm someone, I think what could potentially happen is that we create these lists of questions that are important to us that they get the answers to on the front end, that can be given to us in written form, where it doesn't have to be a public interrogation. It can be, on the record, these are their responses to those questions, and this is who we're appointing to this agency.
Okay, thank you. Councilwoman Ortega?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm going to just make comments at this point, if you're okay with that, unless you still have people that have questions.
I do, but I'm okay with you making
Okay. So first of all, I want to thank you both for collaborating, because I know there were a number of different proposals that initially came before the Charter Review Committee, and I think this one landed in a good place by merging the two efforts together. I think this also creates the opportunity for the building of a good working relationship between the appointees, who are typically accountable to the administration, but they have to all work with us. If it's not coming before the committees to present their budgets, their proposals, whatever, it's oftentimes just dealing with us with constituent concerns and complaints. And I think this sort of starts off that working relationship, if you will. And, some of us aren't going to be here because, a number of us are termed out, but I think this creates a little more of that balance between the powers of the administrative and the legislative branch. And I'm happy to support this moving forward to the floor of council for a vote, and then on to the voters.
Okay, we have a few more questions. Councilman Hines?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And actually, I have more a comment than a question, but to Councilmember CdeBACA's point and to Madam Chair's most recent question, we get, in our office, we get people all the time reaching out to us demanding that we do something about something in the executive branch. Like this morning, we got an email from a officer in an RNO demanding that we change a stakeholder engagement process, that it is the engagement process is moving forward with, and that we need to step in. And I think that there's a disconnect between what people believe we have as power and the power we have. And so, for example, Parks and Rec is appointed by the mayor, and there's no relationship at all with the legislative branch in that appointment process. And so there's a bit of a disconnect, and some of this is education, but really these RNO officers should know, but whatever, they believe that we have more authority than we do. sometimes we even get employees in the executive branch sending constituents of both, of the Denver residents from the executive branch to us to ask us to do something about the executive branch. And so, I think that there continues to be tension, and I support this because I think that there should be a bit more of a bridge. There should be a relationship, and that doesn't answer or address the education that has to happen. But I think that people, to Councilmember CdeBACA's point, people already think that we have a confirmation, we have a stake in the confirmation process, and people believe that the legislative branch has more power than it does. And maybe we should have 3 fully functioning branches of government. And I'm not trying to say that we need to steal power from the executive branch or whatever, but I think it is important for us to have. The voters have said that we have a strong mayor system in Denver. That's great, but that doesn't mean that we have to have a system where people think that the legislative branch has power than it doesn't, and I think that this kind of more accurately aligns perception with reality. So thank you for bringing this forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilwoman Gilmore, did you have another question?
Nope, I'm good. Thank you, Madam Chair.
And Councilwoman Kenichi, you didn't have one? Okay, I had a question. You mentioned that Councilman Flynn had a question about interim appointments, and that was one of my questions too, is the timing issue. You did mention a shot clock. Are you putting that in the ballot
Yes,
measure?
so that is written into the law. So the fact that it's a resolution, so one reading with a 30-day shot clock as a standard, just like any other resolution that moves forward and through on consent.
I think only contracts have a shot clock.
That is the way it's written
Oh, okay. All right.
in the charter right now. Do you want to?
I think what you're saying is, I think the answer is that she's written it into the proposed draft.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so then how does that, how does it impact interim? So just for example, a lot of times it is difficult to find someone to do any job when you know the person who is hiring you is not going to be there forever, whether it's the mayor or a person in the private sector who might be, only there for a year. But it's hard to hire someone if they know they're only going to be in that job for a year. So are you putting anything about interim in the ballot measure, or is that something you want to work out after?
I'm not putting anything about interim in the language. I don't think that that is something that is appropriate to put in the charter. I think that that's appropriate for policies and procedures. I think it's something that we can absolutely discuss, but I think that, temporary or interim, appointments are not something that council necessarily would need to have buy-in into, because it's a temporary position. Now, when that temporary position, let's take, for example, Murphy, who just was appointed as the official head, but was in a temporary position as an interim for a while. In that interim appointment, I don't think it's appropriate for council to, take the time to do that. But that's my opinion. Do other people on council feel that way? I don't know. I think we need to have a conversation about that. That's why I think that we need to sit down and have a stakeholder conversation about that. And, and that needs to be in our policies and procedures. I don't think that's something that's appropriate to be written into the charter.
Okay, but let me just follow up with that. Kirsten, so if it's not in the ballot measure, we can't go back and change it, can we?
Well, there's
No, but
nothing in
that's
there
not,
now.
but that's a policies and procedures conversation, is not something that it's not part of the law, right? The law is council council approval of mayoral appointees. An interim appointment is not an appointee. So that's a separate issue.
Yeah, so I think that you might be saying different things. to answer
Am I
Councilwoman
misunderstanding the
Black's question, I think you're asking whether if this draft were to go forward with no changes, could council have control over interim in any way? And the answer to that question is no. And then I don't know if you want to fill in any gaps on that part.
No, that's the answer.
Are you saying you want to and we should
No,
have
I
a
just was
conversation about
wondering-
that? I guess I'm not
No, I
picking
was
up what
just
you're putting down here.
wondering if you addressed interim or not.
No,
So,
I did not.
Okay.
But I do think that the timeline is a critical part of this, because you don't want to interim for 2 years, right? And so we're putting this timely manner in there because we don't want to see it drag on unnecessarily or as a political stunt or tactic. And to put the language in there in what is the equivalent of our city's constitution doesn't quite make sense to make it that rigid. So I personally wouldn't want to see it in there, but if people want to discuss that,
Yeah, I mean, we're open to it. What we felt was appropriate instead of writing interim into the law itself was to put in the timeliness requirement of saying there is it needs to be filled in a timely, the position needs to be filled in a timely manner, and then not including an interim position as something that council would approve.
Yep, okay.
In this law. That's how we handled it. That's the proposal that's in front of you today. If that's something that you want to change, now is the moment to let's discuss it.
I do not think that it should be changed.
Okay.
But Councilwoman Ortega
I just
and then
wanted
Councilwoman.
excuse me, to ask a little bit different question about people who are serving in a position as an appointee under a current mayor where the next person coming in as mayor wants to keep that same person. Kim Day is an example. So she was a Hickenlooper appointee, and Mayor Hancock chose to keep her. Do you see council's role being still involved in a situation like that? And because technically,
Yes.
it's
That's a new mayor. That's a new appointment. Under a new mayor, that would have to be a reapproval.
okay.
As opposed to, say, a mayor being re-elected
Right.
and continuing appointments.
Yeah.
In which case, that's not a new mayor, it's not a new appointment, it's just a continuing position.
Okay,
So that's a different situation.
that's important clarification. So,
and I think that when we go back to what we mentioned earlier about other cities that don't politicize agencies in this way, we're getting a little bit closer to depoliticizing, because if we have that relationship with the mayor to select these people, and we have the relationship with the agency heads once they're selected, it might change the nature of the conversation when a new mayor comes in. You might not have a mayor who wants to clean house because there is a conversation with council, there is buy-in and understanding about who has been serving the city well to date, and what our thoughts are about those different agency heads. We might even have power to say, as council members who've been in the seat with a new mayor, this person is actually really great. This person is actually really helpful, which could increase the likelihood of keeping a more, a cycle that's not so susceptible to such high turnover with every new mayor.
okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Gilmore?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I want to make sure I'm understanding this. So let's just use Murphy as an example. So Murphy was interim for a period of time, but now he has been appointed officially as the Director of Safety. So if this goes through, if the voters pass this, so we would have then had the opportunity at committee to sit down and talk with Murphy before and give our opinion on it through this process, the way you're outlining it today. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes, but not retroactively. But yes, if this had been in place when, this week or this last week, then yes.
Right.
So an
Okay.
example that's related directly to my proposal is the sheriff, because we don't currently have a sheriff, and we're unlikely to have a sheriff prior to this election. That would be someone who would likely be the first political appointee in this cycle to go through that process, where we would have the ability to really address our concerns with him. And Murphy, you bring Murphy up, and I think it's a good example because he's brand new. We might love Murphy, and when we get a new mayor in 3 years, we might not want to get rid of Murphy. And so our relationship with Murphy means something different under this paradigm than it does right now, if that makes sense.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilman Clark?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think, thank you, Councilmember Ortega. You asked a question that I hadn't thought about, and I just want to get clarification from legal, Kirsten, that is, the appointment is new only if the person is new, not if because a lot of things, even though I'm in my second term, I'm me, but it's a new cycle, right? Like a lot of the laws around different stuff. So that is the interpretation is that even though it's a new 4 years, it's not a reappointment if that person continues in that. But if it's a new person, then that counts as a new appointment that would trigger this?
Kirsten Crawford, Legislative Counsel. So I do think it's probably worthwhile having us sit down and just making sure that the language is clear, because I envisioned that unless they're removed, it would just be a ongoing. We hadn't written a term in there, but let's just make sure that that's the language that's on the paper.
New mayor.
I don't yet know how I feel about what we should do. I'm just trying to get clarity, because there are certain things that even if it's the same person in a new term, you're really a new person, because even state law prohibits us from voting on our own pay. Why we vote on it for the next time, but if you win a second term, then it is you. And I just,
this is great.
how
I'm
it could
glad
be
that we
interpreted, I think we should be intentional about how you want it to be.
That's fantastic that that's great that you've noticed this. That's wonderful, because I think the way I understand it to be written and the way Kirsten is understanding it to be written are two different things. So let's chat about this before we bring it through. Quick question then for everyone, is that something that we need to clarify before we move along, or is that something that we can move forward and clarify via email, or how do you want to manage that?
Just my opinion, thank you, Madam Chair. It should be clarified, but I don't think it needs to be held over in committee to clarify. I think it's just like Councilwoman Ortega's last week, where she said, I'm amenable to some changes, but I think it should be clear in the language so that it's not being interpreted by different mayors in different ways, because the language is.
No, that's great. I'm so glad that we, totally, I'm really glad that we figured that out. Yeah.
Okay, Councilwoman Kinich?
Yeah. I just want to share my opinion that I do not believe that if the appointments don't lapse, then I don't believe it's appropriate to reconfirm someone carrying over. So that is my preference. I believe the language might, executive orders, for example, don't lapse, generally speaking, unless you go in and you revoke it, even if it's a prior mayor who issued it. So, we would need to research whether appointments lapse or if they don't. But so I would be very opposed to taking someone who's been on the job, because let's just be honest, these are hard jobs. And there's no way that you're not going to have some issues. If you were qualified to be in your job, it sounds a lot more like firing to get in the middle of someone who's been doing the job just because the mayor turns over. That does not feel right to me, because it's just too complicated. So I think it's important that if an appointment is made under one mayor and it carries over, our arts and venues director, Kent Rice, for example, came over from Hickenlooper and served. In my opinion, it would not be appropriate for me to intervene and say, are you qualified for this job? That's just a different point. You've been doing the job. I'd like you or I don't like you. It becomes a different kind of vote. So I just want to say I believe the way it's written now would not, so I'm disagreeing with the interpretation you shared.
Okay.
But, and I would be opposed to, I don't think we need to change it for that to be the interpretation, but we can check whether appointments lapse. That's my guess is the question. But just wanted to go on the record that I do not believe we should be getting in the middle of someone who's doing the job if they carry over. Carryover is healthy for the city. We don't want to discourage it, for example. You might take you months to get going as a new mayor. You don't want, immediately firing someone because it's going to take you a while. So I just think there's unintended consequences of discouraging carryovers, and it becomes a lot more about whether I like you or not, and a lot less about your qualifications if you're already doing the job. So that's my rationale.
And it boils down, to, does the mayor like you or not? Either way. So if it carries over and a new mayor comes in and doesn't like you or doesn't like your performance, they still have that administrative power to do something about it.
Councilwoman Sandoval, did you have another question?
Yeah, I had one other question. So just for clarity, this will go forward. It doesn't have to be called out at committee. A council member calls it out, or it is something like we have our consent and we have our action items. Does it always live on the action item?
Nothing lives on the action items unless we put it there, so it doesn't have
So it could technically be on consent, and if a council member wants to call it out or the chair wants to call it out, then we would have the discussion at committee.
Right, our proposal is that it goes through on consent, is that every single one of these goes through on consent.
Okay.
That is the proposal. It
And-
would only be called out for a conversation if a council member for some reason wanted to. The proposal is that it goes through on consent.
And then just to reiterate what Councilwoman Kanich said, I have to agree. I think there was some rollover from Hickenlooper into Hancock that had some consistency that I had never seen before. I know everyone's going to give different examples. My example is the fire department. I had never seen a fire chief roll over from one mayor to another. So if they're doing the job, I agree that it complicates it if we bring them out. So that's just my opinion. Thank you.
Councilman Hines?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would agree with Council Members Kanich and Sandoval that rollovers, just let them roll, so to speak. I know this is kind of older, this is part of older conversation in this committee meeting, but going back to interim appointments and the reasonable period, I brought that question up in the Charter Committee, and I think we had a bit of a discussion back and forth, and because we at the federal level have a whole bunch of interim directors that are escaping congressional oversight, and so that was the example that I brought forward, and the idea was, well, what is reasonable period? How can does that have to, could that live in our charter? And I think that I agree with what was settled at the time, and that it probably shouldn't live in the charter, the policy discussion of what reasonable period is, or what happens if you do an interim for 364 days and then appoint another interim for another 364 days if you were to legislate that the reasonable period was 1 year or less, or whatever. So I think I would support the sponsors' idea of we have certain bits that are in our city's constitution, as in the charter, and we have certain bits that are policy, and I would agree that the interim appointment discussion should be more in policy discussion rather than in our charter. So I just wanted to mention that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilwoman Ortega?
I just wanted to add that when you have changeover in leadership, it is not uncommon to keep some continuity for a period of time. It's not always. I mean, in a lot of cases, people are asked to reapply for their positions. And it's for the sake of just keeping the work of that agency moving forward until, in many cases, a committee is formed, a selection committee, to look at all of the cabinet positions and then figure out, which ones they may want to have somebody different in those positions. And so I think, I had asked that question just to have that clarity on how we answer that as once we start talking to the public about the list of things that will move on to the ballot, we're going to be asked to explain them, right? And so having that clarity will be an important part of just how we deal with that. But it's not unusual for some people to be carried over, but it's not always anticipated that they remain because we all, they work at the pleasure of the elected official. So just like our staff do with us.
No, that's great. We'll check into it.
Thanks.
And thanks for pointing it out.
Yeah.
All right, any other questions?
Can I move the bill forward?
I just want to say one thing before we do that. So I think you have direction to make a few minor changes.
Yep.
And so,
Or, well, at least do
Clarify.
a quick conversation about whether because it sounds to me like from the way it's written now, I'm wrong and everybody else here wants it to stay exactly the same way it's written, which is okay with me if that's the way everybody else wants it to stay. So it doesn't seem like there's actually any changes that need to be made.
No, it's just clarifying it more than anything.
It was just me that needed to get sorted out and not the writing of the bill,
okay, all right.
which is totally okay.
Councilman Clark?
I mean, I'm not the attorney in the room, so I will defer, but I do think that if there is a level that it could be interpreted in a different way, then better to make sure that it, even if it's an overstatement that's unnecessary, let's overstate it so that it's clear. But
We'll check.
Okay, perfect. So you will work with Kirsten on that?
Yep.
And that we all feel comfortable moving it forward to the full council? And so,
Yep,
Councilwoman
so I'm
Otero?
moving the bill.
Second.
All right. And all those in favor, please say aye.
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 All right. Great. Thank you very much. Great
Thank you, guys.
discussion. And again, I'm sorry about the other proposal, but it'll be here in a couple of weeks, and I
the
hope to
23rd?
see you all next week.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, we are adjourned. Thank you.